everyone. Welcome and thank you for attending this month's webinar presented by Dr. Byron Erath. My name is Nicole Tolvey and I am the chair of the ISES, International Society of Exposure Science Membership Committee, and I will be moderating this webinar. For those of you who are not society members, please consider joining the society as we offer many benefits to our members, including exclusive access to this recorded webinar after the completion of the live webinar series. So I have a few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. In the upper right-hand side of your computer screen, you will see the control panel for the GoToMeetings platform. Please note that the webinar is in listen-only mode. Throughout the presentation, you can type in a question or a comment in either the question box or the chat box. We will answer questions at the end of Dr. Byron's presentation, and we will monitor the chat throughout to make sure that you don't have any logistical or other issues during the webinar. So let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Byron Erath received his PhD from Purdue University in 2009. After completing postdoctoral research at the George Washington University, he joined the faculty of Clarkson University in 2012. His research is focused on experimental investigations of fluid structure acoustic interactions with an emphasis on voiced speech production. In 2019, he was awarded both the Clarkson University Excellence in Research and Scholarship and the Pi Tau Sigma Professor of the Year Awards. And with that, I will turn the seminar over to Byron. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. So it's good to be here, and certainly thank you for ISES for this opportunity to speak with everybody today. So as Nicole said, my background is really more in voice speech production, and so this has been kind of an interesting, I don't want to call it pivot, but application of some of our work today. And so what I want to talk about and go through here, there we go, is talk a little bit about why do we care about speaking in virus transport, maybe a brief history of kind of some of the things that we've looked at, what's inspired us to take a look at this. Prior work that's out there in the literature related to airborne transport of viruses due to speech. And then I want to get into more what's, I guess, a more comfortable area for me, kind of the mechanics of speech, voiced and unvoiced speech sounds, how those are produced, and how those influence some of the dynamics, I should say transport dynamics during speech. Talk a little bit about some of our ongoing current efforts here at Clarkson, and certainly I'll be sure to acknowledge we've got a number of colleagues that have been working on this as well. And then give a wrap up. I won't say conclusions because this is really still kind of a lot of work in progress that we're going on. And so we'll kind of wrap up, and where do we go from here, take a look at it. Okay, so background on this a little bit. So really kind of where I came into this was actually before COVID-19, about a year and a half ago. In talking with some of the other colleagues here, we were looking at seasonal influenza and the spread of seasonal influenza. And I had kind of a moment that made me scratch my head a little bit, and that is, if we reflect upon some of the mitigation procedures and guidelines that have come out on how to prevent the spread of seasonal influenza, there's common recommendations that we know. Turn your head and cover your mouth when you cough, which is then turned into cover your cough with your elbow. And if you look at that, those recommendations actually have come out relatively recently. In 2000, the WHO mentioned the importance of turning your head and covering your mouth when you cough to prevent the spread of droplets. The ECDC and the Maine Medical Association actually was the first one that documented was coughing into your elbow rather than your arms in that. And so we know there's these standard mitigation procedures. But as I reflected on this and looked at the infection rates, I saw kind of something interesting, right? So these are plots here from the CDC. The top plot is deaths per 100,000 from the seasonal influenza each year. On the bottom is infections per 100,000, but we've only got from 2010 on. And as you look at this, you'll kind of see something interesting. So here's the trend of where the guidelines changed of turn your head, cover your mouth when you cough, thinking about kind of this idea of, transport due to large droplets. Here's where cough into your elbow and tissue. And so we would think, well, if coughing and sneezing in that is a primary vector of spread for the seasonal influenza, well, once we start implementing these safety and mitigation procedures, we should see a change in the infection rate and in the death rate. And of course, we looked at this data and said, well, that's not really what's going on. So what are we missing? Is there something that we're not thinking about? And that was kind of where we thought about, well, maybe speech, we know that it produces droplets. There's particular speech intonations I'll talk about that can propel these droplets, both the larger form and aerosolized forms over large distances. Nobody seems to be looking at that. Maybe this is something we should think about. And so about a year and a half ago, we tried to start getting some funding here at Clarkson. Of course, everybody told us, oh, you're crazy. Nobody's going to want to wear a mask all the time. That's, that's foolish. Well, let's just work on a vaccine. And then this thing called COVID-19 happened, and suddenly there was great interest in, maybe we should rethink this. And really, this kind of came to a forefront, I think, based on the hearings back in April, where Dr. Harvey Feinberg made the comment that I've got here. Additional research, when asked, he was asked about the possibility of SARS CoV-2 virus being spread by speech. And it's kind of a long sentence, but basically says, yes, we need to have a better understanding of the risk of aerosols and the risk of those both by exhalation and normal speech. So not just coughing and sneezing. And this is also obviously particularly important relative to COVID-19 because of the role of the asymptomatic spreader, right? People that aren't coughing and sneezing. So how are they spreading that? And of course, that's where speech and breathing becomes more important. So other ways that we can kind of look at, well, maybe there's some credence for why speech is important, is if we go into the literature, and admittedly, these are kind of order of estimate or order of magnitude estimates. There's work that's been done on the number of droplets that are produced during a coughing event, how many droplets are produced when you're counting from 1 to 100, the rate of droplet production during sustained phonation. And if we do a little bit of math on this, there's a couple different ones we can look at, mass concentrations as well. And they all come out to roughly somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 10 minutes of talking produces about the same size distribution and the same quantity of droplets that coughing does, that a violent cough does. And so again, we look at this again, particularly with regards to the asymptomatic spreader, and we ask, well, how often do you talk compared to coughing, right? If somebody was coughing every 2 to 10 minutes, we would think like, that's bad. We should probably remove them from the environment. But we don't think about that with respect to talking, even though there is still that high probability of generating and transporting these droplets out and infecting other individuals. And so that's kind of what got us thinking about, well, maybe we need to look at speech as a modality or a vector of transmission here. And my way of kind of looking at this was that if we want to be able to understand the infection risk due to speaking, there's kind of 3 steps that we need to go through. First off, we need to know the size distribution of the droplets that are expelled during speech. We also need to know the quantity and concentration then of those droplets that are expelled. And I'll talk about actually these first 2 points. There's a lot of really great work that's been done on this already. Some of it actually really recent. I'll mention an article published by Bill Ristenpart's group that was published actually in January, very presciently here right before the outbreak. But then the third thing that's missing is understanding the distance that these droplets are expelled, how they travel, how they mix into the environment, how it's influenced by things like air conditioning, ventilation strategies, and things like that. And so that's kind of how we're coming at this problem. So I'll talk a little bit about what's been done on these topics and then kind of what our approach has been as well. So first off, again, there's a pretty good understanding of the size distribution or of the droplets that are produced during speaking. There's kind of a seminal paper from back in 2011 talking about this idea of the bronchial, the laryngeal, and oral mode. That is, we can generate droplets due to breathing as our bronchioles open and close, and as they do that, we get bands of mucus. The air goes through that, it breaks those up into droplets, and so they get aerosolized down deep in the lung, and then as you're breathing and talking, those get expelled out. In addition, there's the laryngeal mode, and this is as you're speaking, we'll talk about this in much more detail, your vocal folds or vocal cords. Those vocal folds are oscillating back together, and they're a mucus covered surface, so you have high velocity passing over those, aerosolizing the droplets as well as them contacting together. And so you can get, like in this picture over here, little bands of mucus that stretch across, and again, as the airflow goes through there, it aerosolizes those droplets, or I should say aerosolizes, but produces those droplets, which may be large or small, that then are then transported out of the mouth as well. And then we have the oral mode, which is what's always disappointing to me, right? Is I get done teaching class and I look down at my laptop and my tablet, and you've got little drops of spittle all over, right? And you discreetly try and wipe it up and hope that nobody notices. And so as you're speaking at the mouth, again, due to your saliva and your mouth and tongue, the oral posturing, you're also producing then larger droplets there. And again, these measurements have been made and are very well understood. If you look at this plot over here on the left, this is the distribution of speaking versus coughing. And you can see there's actually a very significant amount of overlap, that speaking produces about the same size distributions as what coughing does. Although, as we mentioned earlier, coughing does it in larger concentrations, whereas then sustained speaking, you'll get that larger volume fraction of droplets that are produced as well. And so we've got a pretty good idea of what these droplet size distributions are. And then we want to look at concentrations as well. And this is it looks right now just like a kind of a colorful plot. I'll try and explain this. This is, like I mentioned, the really neat work that was done out of Bill Ristenpart's group that was published this January, I think. And one of the things that I'll talk about in speech is hopefully one of the take-home messages today, is that speech is a highly transitory, unsteady event, right? As I'm speaking, your mouth and tongues and lips are moving, and there's a lot going on there based on the different sounds that you're making. And so what they did is they looked at the droplet size distribution and quantities as a function of essentially intonation. And so what they did is they had a bunch of respondents read what's called the rainbow passage. Whoops. And the rainbow passage is used very commonly in speech language pathology. It's a phonetically balanced passage about a paragraph long, and it basically talks about what it's like a rainbow, how a rainbow is formed, finding a pot of gold, and that. It's kind of a nonsense paragraph. But in speaking the paragraph, it uses all of the different utterances and sounds that are typically used during voice speech production in English. And so it includes kind of all the different sounds you could expect to make while speaking English. And so what they did is they broke this up into the phrases, which is what we have on the x-axis here, and then looked at, for each individual, the size and distribution of droplets, which is really, really useful information, because now we understand not just how many droplets you produce on average when speaking, but rather how that concentration and how those sizes vary based on the particular utterances. And again, that's going to be kind of the main take-home message, is that just trying to represent speech as some average production of droplets or average velocity out of the mouth, I think really overlooks a lot more of the complex physical interactions that occur. And so they did this really neat work here. So like I said, when we talk about those three things that we want to answer, there's been some really good work on the first two, but it's the third one, which is, okay, so we produce these droplets. We know they're going to be carried out by the airstream exiting the mouth. What does that look like, and how is that going to contribute to the transport of these droplets out into the environment? And there's actually very, very, very little work that's been done on this. Prior to the coronavirus, there were just 1 or 2 papers where individuals have used particle image velocimetry, which is a laser diagnostic technique where you can purposefully put droplets into a flow. Usually you'll use like a studio fog machine, and you can essentially track how those droplets move, and you take 2 images a short time apart, and you track how far the droplets move in that time. And so if you've got a delta X divided by a delta T between the 2 images, you can get velocity vectors. Excuse me. And so these are velocity vectors right here of somebody counting. And this is just counting, I think it was 1 to 10. And so you see a jet coming out here, but we don't know at what time this jet happened. We don't know for which particular utterance it was. It's hard to look at this and say, oh, that's representative of what speech is. I mean, we can look at it and say, okay, it's got a velocity of about 2 meters per second. There's been some other work that shows in individuals counting, the velocity at the mouth is around 1 to 4 meters per second in that. But it doesn't really tell us how that varies based on particular utterance. There's another one here on the right that came out of Howard Stone's group at Princeton that's in a preprint right now. And they did some PIV, but now they said a couple phrases: we will beat the coronavirus and sing a song of sixpence. And if you look at these PIV images, they've taken the average of somebody saying those words, as they're taking a whole bunch of images in time as somebody saying those phrases, and then average them together. And you see these average velocities here that kind of spread out, right? The yellow being higher velocity. But then they've drawn in arrows. If you go through and look in the specific individual instances in time, how that velocity comes out and exits the mouth can vary quite significantly based on the words that you're saying, right? Some of them, like if we look at this, sing a song in 6 tends to go down really low, and we'll show with some of the preliminary work that we've got, we can explain why this happens. It actually has to do with that S in there. Pence goes up, and of tends to go up, and that's actually, we'll be able to show a little bit more specifically why we get those behaviors. But the idea is there's some credence here that speech is not just a steady jet that comes out, right? Oftentimes, when in aerosol scientists, when they're thinking about, how do I model the plume coming out of a mouth, they just look at a steady jet, right? Because that's kind of the first order approximation. But what we'll see is that it's actually much more complicated than that. So there's some work that's been done on this, but this is a large area where there's still a lot of knowledge that we need to get better understanding on. Now, to understand why we think that's important, I want to take a little bit of a side now and talk about the mechanics of speaking, because that will then help us give a better understanding of why just a steady jet coming out of the mouth is not a good approximation for how droplets are going to leave the mouth when speaking or coughing or something like that. Although coughing isn't quite as egregious because you tend to just have an open vocal tract, but certainly while speaking, we want to think more at the granular level of details of what's going on as we're talking. And so this is really kind of my, I guess, wheelhouse, what I'm used to here. So let's talk about first how we speak. So if you find your Adam's apple in your throat, right, we all kind of know where that is. That's right where your larynx is. And your Adam's apple is what's called the thyroid notch. It's kind of the prominence right here. If you can see my mouse, hopefully, it's that prominence right there on the thyroid cartilage. And your vocal folds or vocal cords are housed within that structure. Okay, so if we were to look down somebody's throat, this is their thyroid notch up here at the front. And your vocal folds or vocal cords are 2 bands of tissue that stretch across the airway. Okay, now this has kind of some of the tissue removed. And what you're seeing here is the thyroarytenoid muscle that connects to the thyroid up front, and your arytenoids, these little gray triangular shapes back here. Okay, and that's your 2 bands of tissue there. Now, if we take a coronal section, so slice somebody right down through the front and look at them, and now include the tissue, these are your vocal folds right here. So these gray bands of tissue right here, if we were to cut them in half, they'd be this little red thing right here and the little red thing over here. Okay, that's your thyroarytenoid muscle, and then you have tissue that extends over that. Okay, and as you talk, you build up a critical pressure in your lungs, and air is forced up through your vocal folds right here, and your vocal folds undergo self-sustained oscillation. So if I just say, my vocal folds are sitting there oscillating together. And that oscillation is actually pretty neat dynamics. It's a little bit more complex than what we would normally think. So here I have a series of kind of how the vocal folds change in time. The upper panel is looking from the top. The bottom panel, so it's kind of 2 rows. The bottom panel is, again, this coronal section. Ignore these blue areas. That's just kind of showing what the velocity tends to do when it's coming out. But initially, when you want to speak, your vocal folds seal off the airway. That critical pressure gets built up, and it forces the vocal folds apart. They initially have kind of a convergent opening. As that flow accelerates through there, it pushes those vocal folds apart. Eventually, they reach the elastic limit, and due to the flow acceleration, the pressure starts to decrease within the vocal folds. And so that combination of the decreased pressure and the elastic limit wanting to snap back, those vocal folds come back together, and as they do, they form kind of this divergent configuration and then close together. And so this is what's happening when we're undergoing voiced speech. And by voiced speech, and we distinguish between voiced and unvoiced speech. For voiced speech, what we mean is when our vocal folds are oscillating, okay? Sounds that we make like vowels, ah, oh, ooh, okay? And this is happening quite rapidly. If I say ah, I'm about 100 hertz. So that means it's going through this complete cycle, opening to closing about 100 times a second. For females that might have a higher voice, can be all the way up to 220 hertz. And of course, singing and falsetto, you can get very wide ranges. But this is kind of the typical range of what we would think of as kind of normal speech production. Okay, so for voiced phonation, we have these vocal folds oscillating, undergoing this. Okay, but we also have unvoiced speech sounds. Okay, now to confuse you guys and make it seem like I'm smarter than I am, I've switched the images. So now your thyroid is up here, your arytenoids are kind of these bumps back here. And we want to talk about, so the vocal folds, they can oscillate, but they aren't always closed and oscillating. Okay, so when we want to speak, the vocal folds here adduct or add together, and so they seal off the airway. The flow comes up out of the vocal folds, it'd be coming straight up out of the page, and they begin to oscillate. But when we're just breathing or when we're producing unvoiced speech sounds, our vocal folds are in the open position. They just form a triangular opening. So when I'm breathing, if I want to make an unvoiced speech sound like an F or a TH sound, if I say, or even if I'm whispering quietly, when I'm whispering, my vocal folds aren't oscillating, they're just in that open configuration. Okay, now we can think of this as these unvoiced speech sounds. Well, then where does the sound come from? Voiced speech sounds, as those vocal folds oscillate, you're pinching off and then releasing the pressure, and then pinching off and releasing the pressure. And so that creates a time-varying pressure wave, which is an acoustic source, which is then emitted out the mouth as the sound. For unvoiced speech sounds, we produce sounds at different areas of our mouth. And there's a lot of different unvoiced speech sounds. Again, if you talk to a linguist, they'd probably cringe at the kind of simplified way that I'm going to explain it here. But we can think of really kind of a couple different consonant voice sounds that are, or excuse me, consonant unvoiced sounds. Okay, so the two kinds that we're usually interested in are fricatives. And fricatives are where we have an occlusion somewhere in the vocal tract, but our vocal folds aren't oscillating. So if I make, like over here on the right, an S sound, like a S, or if I make an F sound, like a F, or a TH sound, so this is using the International Phonetic Alphabet, so this is their notation, there's lots of funny letters. This theta symbol is like a TH sound. And you can look at this and you can see the tongue position relative to the teeth and lips and things like that as you're making these sounds. Okay, so fricatives are where you have an occlusion and you're just forcing air through there. Your vocal folds aren't oscillating at all. The other ones, and you can also have affricates where you have combinations of fricative and voice speech sounds, like a V, right? If I say V, I'm getting air coming out of my lips, but I'm also have my vocal folds oscillating. Same thing with a Z type sound. So again, there's lots of other sounds, but we're interested in just these kind of two primary ones, fricatives, and the other one is plosives. Okay, again, these are our unvoiced speech sounds. Plosives are produced when we occlude the vocal tract, so we close it off, we build up air somewhere, and then we suddenly release that air. So it's the P sound when we say pop, right? That initial P, we close our lips, build up sound, open up our lips real quickly, and we get that burst of air and we get that pop sound. Same thing with other sounds. If we say like a T or a D, we actually close off the airway with our tongue up at the front of our palate. And if we do more of a guttural K or G sound, now we've got the tongue closing off the airway back at our soft palate, and again, suddenly opening up and releasing that air. Okay, even a cough is essentially a plosive, except for when we cough, our vocal folds are what seal off the airway. We build up a really, really high pressure, and then when we open those vocal folds, we get a large expulsion of air coming out of it. And so that's how we generate cough as well. Okay, so little bit of kind of recap. I realize we're talking about a lot of stuff, and I'm always told that I talk really quickly, so maybe I should try to make myself slow down here. Really, the point that I'm trying to get is we have voiced speech sounds when our vocal folds are oscillating, but we also have unvoiced speech sounds. And those unvoiced speech sounds, we're jumping back and forth between all of these when we're speaking, okay? And so if we're thinking about, well, what does the airflow look like as it's coming up through the vocal tract and exiting out of the mouth? Well, it's obviously going to depend on what the geometry of our vocal tract is and how our lips and teeth and tongue are positioned. All that's going to affect what that air coming out is going to look like. And of course, it's that air that we want, so we can figure out how these droplets are transported into the environment. Well, what you should be thinking again is, this doesn't look like just a steady jet, right? There's a lot going on with the mouth here, right? If we go to some MRI, I don't think you'll hear the sound, but this is actually somebody speaking the rainbow passage. And this is real-time MRI, all right? So your vocal folds are actually right down in this area right here. And then, of course, you've got, you know, your oral cavity that comes up, your tongue, teeth don't show up in an MRI, your lips moving, and your tongue back here. And as you're looking to this as somebody's talking, what you're seeing is, man, this is changing like crazy in time. And we can think there's airflow coming up during this whole time. And obviously that airflow is going to be getting disrupted and modified and changed really, really quickly as all this is happening very rapidly as somebody is speaking here. And so again, the idea of, well, is just a steady flow model of a steady jet coming out of the mouth really a good representation of voice speech or not? And so, you know, again, kind of with my background in speech, I looked at this and said, man, I think that's really an oversimplification. I think we want to look at particular utterances that may give rise to different fluid dynamic behavior that's going to influence that transport of droplets out into the environment. And where this kind of came from is one night I was grilling about a year ago. It was last fall, I guess. It was cold out on the porch, and so I could see my breath. And it was interesting because as I'm sitting there, different sounds and talking with my wife, different sounds I'm making are creating large plumes of air coming out of my mouth that are sometimes extending 2, 3, 4 feet out into the air based on the sounds that I'm making. And again, if we go back to our understanding of things like fricatives, fricative builds up pressure and it forces air through a narrow constriction. And of course, we know from fluid mechanics or from looking at a river, as a river is flowing down through a stream and it gets really narrow, what happens? The velocity speeds up. Same thing, as air is coming out, if we create a narrow constriction in our mouth, we're going to get a much higher velocity blast of air than if we have an open mouth. And we can do this experimentally very easily just by saying, ah, and holding up your hand in front of your mouth, and you go, ah, and you really don't feel any air coming out, right? Because we have this big open vocal tract. We've got a really wide stream flowing down. But now if we say, or make a TH or an F sound and hold your hand up there, now you feel a really strong blast of air coming out. Our stream is narrowed down, and now we have high velocity, which is going to then also, we would assume, transport particles much further. Okay, the other one that's really interesting, and I'll just kind of mention this without getting too far into the fluid mechanics, is if we go back to plosives, we talked about plosives, we build up pressure and then we open our mouth and we get a sudden release of pressure. Well, as somebody that's involved in fluid mechanics, I really think vortex rings are fun. I should have had a video up here of dolphins playing with vortex rings. But a vortex ring is a coherent fluid structure that is a ring of rotating fluid. Okay, if you've ever seen somebody blow a smoke ring, that's a vortex ring. And the way that experimentally that we produce vortex rings is we have a cavity with a hole and we build up pressure in that cavity and then suddenly release it. And you will generate as air, as a slug of fluid gets pushed out of like a piston, you'll generate a vortex ring. So again, if we're thinking about this from the perspective of plosives, well, I basically have a tube, which is my mouth. I've got an opening at the end. I build up pressure. I open it up. I get a slug of fluid that comes out. That tells me I'm probably going to get a vortex ring that rolls up and propagates out. And that's important because vortex rings in fluid mechanics are these coherent structures that can self-advect due to their own rotation and thereby propagate very, very large distances. And so thinking about this, we said, man, there's really kind of some neat fluid mechanics that may influence the propagation of fluid and therefore the transport of droplets out in the environment. And we should probably get a better understanding of this if we want to, you know, get a clear understanding of what infection risks are and that due to droplets. And so some of the initial, so that was my comment. There's a lot going on here with the speech. So again, take home message to this point, speech is complex and highly transitory process, and we need to be careful how we investigate it, that we don't overly simplify things by just saying, let's just look at a steady jet and assume that that's what the speech plume or speech jet looks like. So if we want to predict infection risks, like we said, we need to get a better understanding of those velocity fields. And to do that, we can go in and we can measure these things experimentally. We can measure the velocity coming out of a mouth using particle image velocimetry. And we can do it for all these different intonations as well. And we can start to get a better idea of that. Where it becomes difficult, though, is now how do we put the droplets in there? Experimentally, while we can measure the velocity fields, it's very difficult to simultaneously measure the velocity fields and measure the droplets coming out during speech, and then, more importantly, track how those droplets move throughout the room and throughout the environment. And so our approach that we're undertaking this is, well, let's measure the velocity being expelled experimentally. And then once we've measured that velocity, we know what the droplet size distribution and concentrations are. That's been measured before. We'll measure it ourselves and verify that. And then we can take both of those and put those into a computational fluid dynamics model of the fluid flow, where numerically we solve for the flow with the mouth. We use our experimental measures to benchmark it and validate it and say, yes, we're accurate. And then with CFD, it's very easy to go in and say, I'm going to put this distribution of droplets and these concentrations of droplets down in the vocal tract, and now I can track how they move out at the exit of the mouth, how they circulate through the room. I can look at things like changing the ventilation, changing, the background turbulence levels in the ambient environment, and look at now how that influences the concentration and droplet spread throughout any environment that we want to. And so that's kind of the big picture of what we want to do when we're looking at this velocity field, is experimentally measure it, and then be able to marry that with CFD to be able to put those droplet size distributions in there and start to be able to actually predict infection risk in that. Now, as somebody in fluid mechanics, we know the first thing that we usually want to do with fluid mechanics is we could jump straight to the PIV and make a bunch of measurements, but oftentimes we're not even sure what we're looking for, right? I mean, I haven't been able to see, other than kind of looking outside, what my breath looks like for different intonations. I don't know how far that moves. I don't know what kind of temporal resolution that I need. I don't know what kind of spatial resolution I need to completely resolve those flow statistics. And so usually the first thing that we do is flow visualization, right? Which in its simplest form is me sitting on the porch, barbecuing in the late fall, talking to myself and kind of looking at how far that breath plume goes out. And so actually I had an undergraduate, like I said, we've been working on this for about a year. We just had an undergraduate last fall that said, hey, this sounds kind of neat. Maybe I can do some research with this. And so actually just the week before we got shut down here for COVID-19, we were able to get into the freezers here at Clarkson, because we've got a controlled cold environment where you can see your breath pretty well. We just brought in a GoPro camera. We used a Lume Cube light source, fiddled around with a box to kind of get a sheet, and filmed ourselves saying a bunch of different words to kind of see what does it look like. This was kind of our proof of concept of, does speech even generate velocities, or is it just doesn't really go very far, and it doesn't warrant looking at further. And so I'm going to show a video here. This is of me in the freezer saying puppy. And so you can see the air come out. Now, again, not the greatest video. I'm going to slow this down and kind of try and identify some of the things that we see. But with puppy, that plosive, we actually see a vortex ring very faintly that gets ejected right at that initial P sound. And I'll stop and highlight it right there. And again, the contrast is not great, but you can see that guy then go shooting out across the screen before it kind of dissipates due to the condensation. Again, that's one of the shortcomings with this is due to evaporation, we actually don't see the full range of the particles. But we looked in that and said, well, that's kind of interesting. That's one of the things that we saw. If you're saying puppy, there we can see this ejection of vortex rings. And we said a whole bunch of different words. One of the other ones we looked at that was actually really interesting was huff. And again, huff ends with an F, which is one of these fricative consonants. So very narrow gap, high velocity. Okay, and again, so I'll kind of play this in real time and then actually play this as well, kind of slowed down. Okay, so this is me saying huff. And what you end up seeing here is initially when you say huff, you get a very low velocity plume, that ha type sound where your mouth is open, low velocity, but you're expelling a large plume of particles. And that's what we initially seen in kind of this cloud region form out. And then we transfer to the F sound, that which is now the high velocity jet of air. And you'll see that actually penetrate through this big cloud, entrain particles from the cloud, and then propagate those over a much, much larger distance. And again, for the sake of time, I don't have it here, but if we kind of freeze this right at the end and look at kind of where the cloud is at this point, you know, oops. Oh, I thought I could pause it. There we go. If you kind of look at where this cloud is, it was really interesting that we also did coughing. And if, again, I'm kicking myself for not pulling it up here, but if you looked at a plume of coughing, it's almost indistinguishable from somebody saying huff. You're generating out to the same distance, the same volume, you're getting this large spread of the air and the velocity. And so that was what made us kind of think, okay, there's something going on here. This is probably worth investigating a little bit further because this is something people haven't really looked at. We know, you know, with COVID-19, we started to understand, yeah, speaking might be a little bit more of a problem. We should wear a face covering. There's a lot of cool work on what face coverings do, but we still don't have a basic understanding of just how does it spread during speech. And so this was kind of our next step in flow visualization, what we've looked at here before we go, before we haven't gotten to yet, but before we decide to take PIV. And this is using a slightly different version of flow visualization. This is literally you take a teaspoonful of flour, about that, you put it in your mouth, you kind of shake your mouth up and try and get a lot of flour in there, and then you speak. And of course, as you speak, you're expelling out these small little droplets of flour. You try not to choke. I felt like after I had come home after a day of doing this, I had about a bread loaf worth of flour in my stomach. And then we illuminate it with a laser sheet and take images at a low frame per second with a relatively high exposure rate, which allows us to kind of see the streaks of what happens with these for these different utterances. And so this right here is just me saying the word ah-fa. Okay, so just an open vowel ah followed by then the F sound. So let me play it again. And again, you guys, I guess, probably can't hear the sound. I think we tried that before. If I slow it down, it's too bad because it's kind of funny to listen to me saying it slowly because it's like, ah, it's this growl. But you can hear this low growl, which starts right about now. And then you hear the F sound, which is when we get this expulsion of these flour particles, and then it goes back to the ah sound. So with the ah, we don't get a lot of flour coming out, but it depends on how much flour's in your mouth and such like that. But then obviously with that more airy part, we're able to visualize what that jet is doing. And the reason we wanted to do this is our first thought was, well, let's go through and let's look at, based on particular phones, which are the basic building blocks of speech. So for particular phones, sounds that we make, how does that influence the trajectory of what's being expelled at the mouth? And so we'll go through here. We looked at about 8-10 of the standard kind of consonants. The first one that we looked at was what's called a labiodental. So you're creating a fricative with your lips and your teeth, and we're looking at an F sound. Now these are called, this type of F is a stop fricative consonant because we're making an F like you would say with a far sound, right? So when we say far, we're not really blowing air through the teeth. We're really just stopping the air and then releasing it. So in a lot of ways, it's almost more like a plosive. And this is interesting because when we do this, what we see is that we get this short blast of kind of our flour particles, if you will, so we can visualize where the air is going. And you'll see they really don't propagate that far at all, right? They just kind of go out, you know, maybe 4 to 6 inches and stay there when we've got an F sound that's just kind of that, again, that stop consonant. Now we can look at it, and again, so in the square brackets, this is the phonetic representation. Now instead of saying ah-fa, we're saying ah-fa, right? So more of like an F on the huff sound. So it's aspirated at that time, meaning we're making that fricative consonant, but now we're blowing extra air through there. So we've got an huff instead of just a fa. And now we see a big difference, right? We can look at the spread of droplets. It's much broader when it initially comes out. And as we look at our propagation distance, it's also much farther, not to mention that we actually see a slightly upward tilt in our trajectory for this aspirated F sound, for this fa type sound. We can look at thumb, okay? So, and again, we can make different types of TH sounds. There's a the sound, like when you say the, which is more like the far sound, that it's just more of a stop release, or when we say thumb, which is a more of an aspirated sound, which we denote by this theta here. So now we're just saying ah-tha. And I should mention all of these are done just at comfortable speaking level. This one was really interesting because here we actually caught initially a little bit of the ah. So we were calculating, again, I don't have the audio recordings here, but we'd synchronize the video and audio recordings. And so we could hear the audio and synchronize it with the video. Here we're catching the ah sound. And so with the ah, we get a little bit of downward motion of particles. But then when we get the th sound of the ah, tha, you'll notice we get a very high blast. So this kind of downward one is from the ah, and then we've got this tha sound trajectory going very, very quite high, pointing up of that second blast of air. And we can go through and we can look at this for, like I said, we did this for a bunch of different constants. Again, trying to make it repetitive by just doing the ah, saw. We can look at an S sound. And again, if you remember kind of what they saw in Sing a Song of Sixpence, we had a downward trajectory here. If we do a mesh sound, again, we get another downward trajectory, even steeper. If we look at a ha, like a ha for a hot sound, again, we've got much weaker because we don't have as high a velocity of air, but we've got that downward trajectory going on there. And then we can look at some of these voiceless stops or plosives that we have. Spin, like that P sound, so we're just saying apa, like the P in spin. Again, it's really hard to see here. It's a little bit harder to visualize with the flower because the flower droplets are larger, so they don't get entrained in the air as easily. But we do see the same circulation of a slight vortex ring. It's actually easier to see in this last one. And we actually see some interesting things that goes with cough. Some of the work that's been done is that the buoyancy, because you're expelling a hot plume of air, oftentimes tends to trend upward due to buoyancy effects. And we actually see that skewing in that vortex ring a little bit here for the P plosive sound. We can look at a T sound, a ta, and again, here we get a downward trajectory. And then for ka, which is more of that guttural sound at the back of our mouth, again, we get a very, very steep downward trajectory. Okay, so again, kind of the thing to keep in mind is that as we're talking, as I'm speaking here, you're making all these different sounds all at the same time, separated very small instances in time apart. And so just if we qualitatively kind of plot all these different trajectories for what we saw for these different intonations and superimpose them together, what we see is there's a broad distribution in the trajectories that are expelled during sound. That is, it's not just a steady straight jet that's coming out. As you're speaking based on those sounds, you're getting different puffs of air that are skewing up and skewing down and skewing in between, and the momentum of the jet is high and low at some times, and it really creates some really complex fluid mechanics. And so that's kind of where we're at right now. Our next step is we've kind of gone through and qualified this, I should say, with these intonations. We have an idea of how we want to position and look at things. And our next thing is now, okay, we need to start quantifying the PIV velocity measurements, which we're bringing in people actually next week to start measuring with PIV measurements and start looking at, okay, instead of qualitatively, where does it go? Quantitatively, what are the velocities, at 1 meter, 2 meter, 3 meters downstream, what's that velocity? How far does it propagate through for these different intonations? But in the meantime, like I said, we really need to marry the experimental measures of the velocity with computational measures of the velocity, and then be able to ad hoc put those droplets into the accurate velocity fields so we can track how they move throughout the environment. And that's what then we've been working on in tandem with this. We've got a postdoc student that does this. He uses ANSYS Fluent, but he's got some custom codes that he uses. I won't get into the math of all the CFD, partially because, well, I'm an experimentalist, I'm not a computationalist, and so I'm not even completely familiar with everything that he's doing. But in a nutshell, he's got different algorithms that he used to actually track how those particles move throughout the environment in the flow, as opposed to just looking at the flow. And so he's starting running simulations. And so he's got a simplified mouth geometry right here. This is a mouth geometry for an F sound, and this is an aspirated F, so kind of a F. And we've got an idealized mouth geometry in here, kind of straightened out. So this is kind of your uvula in the back of your mouth, and then your lip and teeth constriction at the front. We're running this for a constant pressure condition of about 600 pascals. That's loudness of like normal speech. If you start yelling, you can be up to like 1.5 kilopascals. This gives us a Reynolds number of around 2,000 to 3,000, a max Reynolds number, I should say. And the exit height, the gap between our teeth, is about 1.577 millimeters. And so he just starts this at 0 time and allows the flow to develop over 0.4 seconds. And so you can see the expulsion of this jet here. And initially you can see same thing, you do get kind of a vortex ring that sheds off right from the start and then skews up. You've got a jet, and even the jet itself is quite unsteady, flapping up and down due to interactions with the vortical structures that get shed at the exit of the teeth, which then influences how that really, I should call it a plume rather than a jet because it's transitory, how that plume propagates through. But really one of the interesting things that's come out of this as we start to quantify is, if you remember, I talked about that the velocity, when it's been measured before for people counting like 1 to 10, well, if you go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you never really even have an aspirated F or aspirated TH sound. What we found is the velocities get extremely high. So he's got a magnitude going to 10 meters per second just to make it visualized a little bit better. But actually the maximum velocity he gets in there is almost 20 meters per second. So we get very, very high velocities because of that narrow constriction during this production of an aspirated F sound. The next thing we can look at then is the transport of particles. So now he comes in and he can say, I'm going to put in a distribution of droplets. This is just initial work that he's done. So right now it's just a uniform distribution of the droplet sizes that are color coded over here on the right hand side from 1 micron, 1 micron, up to 50 microns of size of droplets or particles that he's looking at. And so you see some things here. These red ones are the larger ones. He's putting these in and just starting them with no initial velocity. And so the smaller ones accelerate easier. The red ones take a little bit time to get more accelerated out. And now we can track how these particles actually start to get expelled out into the environment. And you see some really interesting things here. Remember, we've got this vortex ring at the start. This is much closer in, zoomed in, and you can see those smaller droplets get caught up in that recirculation region, whereas the larger droplets have more of a ballistic trajectory, which is not surprising, that they tend to just more follow in a straight line. But as we have small scale eddies and currents, those smaller droplets can get caught up in those and transported over drastically different areas and spaces. As well, if you looked in the fluid and in the droplet sizes, even the mouth geometry can have a quite significant impact on the spread of droplets, what gets mixed around, which size of droplets kind of get stuck in a recirculating region in here versus those that get expelled out. You'll see right off it's the small droplets, and the medium ones kind of get stuck recirculating, and then the red ones, the larger ones, eventually get expelled out. And again, these are important physics to think about because as we're looking at speech here, again, speech is highly transitory. We don't ever just go up and say, and make a prolonged F sound. It's for short periods of time. This simulation is for 0.4 seconds. Actually, it was 0.37, and then he turns off the flow. And so in 0.3 seconds, you're able to expel some of those larger droplets. But if it's shorter, we might only get some of those smaller droplets that get expelled out. And so again, keeping all of this in mind is really kind of an important consideration as we're starting to think about and model, you know, what's the velocity look like? How do the droplets get transported through that? And then ultimately, how do they interact with surrounding room currents to actually influence infection risk and things like that? So summary of this, what we're kind of talking about is, like I said, it's really a work in progress. We're still learning here, and there's a lot that we don't know. We do know that speech is highly transient and unsteady, and we need to think about that as we think about kind of these simplified models of, is an average viewpoint of what's the average velocity out of the mouth during speech. Is that really a good model, and does that capture the full complexity of voice speech? In particular, we know that droplet transport is influenced by the local fluid structure and dynamics. And so we need to be very careful for these different utterances and think about, you know, how those are going to influence that droplet transport. And then really what's of most interest is, once we get this, we want to be able to look at, right, what do things like, I've got an air conditioner in the background blowing, and that affects the circulation rate, right? Air exchange rates within a room, how many times do we need that to be able to remove, you know, droplets that may have viruses? And how can that inform us as we think about, you know, kind of organizing and planning indoor events and indoor spaces to be able to mitigate those infection risk? So finally, I want to say, of course, this work is a large multidisciplinary approach. We've got 4 other faculty members here at Clarkson that are working on this. I think Andrea Farrow is going to give the presentation here next month. I want to recognize our postdoctoral researcher, Amir, that's done this numerical work. We've got a PhD student, Tanvir. We're looking to hire new students. So this could be you or one of your students. If you know of anybody looking to get involved in COVID-19 research and is looking to go to graduate school in engineering, put them in contact with us. We're looking for individuals right now. And then also recognize funding from NSF Rapids on this work, as well as some internal funding from Clarkson. So with that, I thank you very much for your participation and attention, and I am happy to take any questions at this point.
So thanks, Byron. That was a great presentation. It was, I found it quite fascinating. So as Byron mentioned, we'll now move on to the Q&A component. So if you do have a question, please type it into the question box, and we will get an answer for you. So we'll give them a second to type in. Maybe we'll give them an answer. I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe it's an answer they want, they don't want. I'll do our best.
So I'll kick it off. I have a question for you. So with the fact that, you know, all the universities are getting ready to start school, so what's the, do you think that the students and the faculty, when they're sitting in the lecture halls, do you think people should be wearing face coverings in order to slow down the transmission of potential virus?
Yes, so there's no question whatsoever you should be wearing a face covering at all times, any times it is, particularly when you're in indoor environments and things like that. There is a fair amount of work, and again, I wanted to kind of focus more on the speech. There's a fair amount of work that's been looking at, you know, how the velocity, certainly there's, I guess, again, there's 2 ways of looking at the velocity and the droplet production. Face coverings and masks do a pretty good job. Obviously, N95 do better at stopping the droplets that are expelled. Face coverings also slow down that velocity significantly. Just like we saw, you know, you can get these, you know, blasts of air that are going out from what we're able to measure, and maybe even further, 2-3 feet. You put a face covering on, and it's confined right there close by to your face. And so, yes, there's no question people should be wearing face coverings and comply with that. That is good science.
Okay, thank you. And one follow-up to that. So do you think then that, if someone's speaking louder and more actively and more energized, is there a potential to actually have more droplets move around than if they're speaking more in a not quite a whisper, but maybe a normal tone of voice?
Absolutely, yes. So again, we can kind of look at this from again, the velocity and the droplet, right? Because we got to look at droplet production, and then we got to look at droplet transport through the velocity fields. Again, Bill Ristenpart's group published some work a couple months ago, no, maybe it was last fall, talking about that if you have somebody speaking at normal versus speaking at a loud intensity, as your intensity goes up, the number of droplets that you're producing goes up. So the volume fraction increases with loudness, so you're putting more droplets out there. From a fluid mechanics standpoint is, you know, again, as you build up more pressure, which is how you get something louder, you're forcing more velocity out there, and so you are increasing the velocity coming out of your mouth as well. So if you're thinking about that and you're talking with somebody and you want to minimize that, yeah, don't get in an argument and yell and scream because you're creating more droplets and you're expelling them further. Speak softly, right? Stay calm, wear your mask, speak softly. So yeah, speaking softly is gonna slow that down. Whispering, that to me is one that is still unknown, and the reason why I say that is some of the early work out of Ristenpart's group has shown that for some of these unvoiced consonants, you don't produce quite as many droplets, which could be good news because, as we showed, when you produce these unvoiced consonants, those are the high velocity that expel further, but they may not be generating quite as many droplets. Whispering, I'm not sure about that. I would guess it's probably the same, because when you're whispering, your vocal folds aren't oscillating. And so you may be producing less droplets, but the flow rate from whispering is much, 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 much higher than when you're speaking. And you can test this just by trying to hold a sustained vowel, which you can do for 20 seconds, 30 seconds, the average person. But if you try and do just kind of a with a whisper, after about 4 or 5 seconds, you run out of breath because you've expelled such a larger volume. So whispering is quieter, but it's more of that breathy voice that may be producing more. That's something that needs investigated, but certainly speaking softly is much better than speaking loudly from a droplet transport and production perspective.
Okay, great, thanks. So that gave people a chance to put in a couple of questions. So we have a question here that says, are you considering particle counters to look at the aerosol droplets?
Yes, so, and again, that's kind of outside of my wheelhouse. I'm a fluid mechanics guy. So Andrea Farrow is our resident aerosol scientist, and she's got some aerodynamic particle sizers. And that's exactly what we're looking at is having somebody speak those same utterances that we're using for the velocity into the aerodynamic particle sizers. Again, a fair amount of that has been done. Like I said, Wrist and Part's done that for the rainbow passage. We plan on doing it for actually the individual utterances rather than as utterances contained within running speech. And we can get those actual distributions, size counts and distributions for particular utterances. And then once we know that, instead of just kind of uniform distribution of droplets like what we had in the initial CFD, that then becomes the input condition for the particles in the CFD condition. So we can mimic the geometry and the flow conditions of the utterance and then put in the right particle size distributions to be able to track how those go out. So yeah, that is a crucial part of the work.
Okay, great. We have a question here related to microphones. Would you recommend that people who need to do lectures use a microphone to help minimize aerosol production?
So again, that's a great point. Yes, using microphones, if it prevents you from having to yell in a classroom or speak very loudly so that everybody can hear you, microphones are good ideas. I mean, obviously disinfect them after use in that. But yeah, there's clear evidence that speaking loudly, speaking animated is going to generate more droplets and expel them further. And so using a microphone is going to help out tremendously with that by being able to keep your voice level down.
Okay, great, thank you. Any further questions from any of our attendees? Now is your chance, please.
Going once, going twice.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you for a very interesting presentation. Thank you everyone who participated in this month's webinar. For those of you who are on the attendee list, please look for an email in the next couple of days that will provide a link to an evaluation. Please take a minute to provide your feedback. Also, we're always looking for ideas on topics. So if you have ideas, please also put that in the evaluation. The recording of today's webinar, along with the handouts, will be posted on the ISCS member portal on the members only side of the website. And as a final reminder, please remember that the International Society of Exposure Science annual meeting is virtual this year, and it will be online September 21st and 22nd. So thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.